Thanks for joining us. My name is Charlie Ciccignano. I'm the head of tech services at the University of West Georgia. I am joined by Joe Marciniak, who is head of content management. Electric resources librarian at Princeton. He used to work for me, so I'm used to calling him a resources person. Corey Halachek, and he is the head of content management at the University of Texas, Austin. And so our presentation, what exactly do you want tech services to do? This came out of some communication issues that I was having with colleagues at West Georgia. So just to give you an idea of kind of the background, we had some consistency issues with liaison outreach. We were a fairly small to medium-sized university, and we were in the process of growing very, very fast. We had a lot of new faculty coming in because of that growth, which was kind of causing some chaotic issues with how we were going to handle liaison outreach. And there was, usually that affects collection development, and we would kind of end up at the end of the year with a lot of unspent allocation money. And so we and tech services would end up sort of spending some of that money when nobody else would, and that ended up causing some friction. So the big question that I wanted to ask was, were we the only people that were experiencing this kind of problem? Is this just something that happens to a small to medium-sized growing university, or is this something that's actually happening on a bigger scale? And does it affect other universities regardless of size? So that's what we were interested in, and we put out a survey on SurveyMonkey to kind of see where some of the data would lead us and let us know whether we were alone in this problem or not. You want to take that over, Corey?
And so before we kind of jump into the survey results, we wanted to give a little bit of background on the campus models that we have in place at each of our institutions. So a few years ago at the University of Texas at Austin, there was a reorganization that took place, and part of that aim was to streamline collection development operations as well as tech services. So a new scholarly resources department was created, and it consisted of some subject specialists, a licensing specialist, a supervisor kind of oversee that operations. And the idea was that liaisons would be embedded and no longer have collection development duties. That actually never took off. So what kind of they ended up with was a group of scholarly resource department librarians doing collection development. Liaisons were still doing collection development. And then the content management department also found itself doing some collection development with approval plans, gifts, and then some packages decisions that way. On the very new horizon, there's going to be another reorg, and this time we're told scholarly resource is actually going to make all the collection decisions unless you happen to be a chosen subject liaison in a certain group. And then also content management will also handle some of the stuff again. So not really sure what that's going to look like. It sounds a lot kind of similar to what we're currently doing. And so as we move forward, and kind of my interest in the survey was looking at the data to think if we had reasons or data to back up decisions that might push content management out of the picture together and allow collection development librarians to make those decisions, or look at ways to kind of radicalize how we're doing content management and collection development all together.
All right, so the model at West Georgia, we had a small liaison program, and as the university started to grow, the instruction team also grew. Most of the liaisons were in instruction, but we had a few outliers, me being one of them for a while before I took over the department. And again, because we were having a hard time actually spending those allocated funds, we would have all of these decisions that would kind of fall to us at the end of the fiscal year. And so there was a lot of tension between instruction and tech services on the best way to spend those funds.
All right, so I'm just going to say a couple of things briefly about the model at Princeton University. I'm brand new to Princeton. I've been there about 10 weeks, so it's not as in-depth of knowledge, but basically the way that it works at Princeton is that all of the collections decisions are made entirely by selectors or the assistant university librarian for collection development. There will be consultation with experts such as faculty or other selectors, but at this point all of the collections decisions go through them. and every department is assigned a selector to work with that department on the things that they need. So it's sort of 100% coverage there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the survey and the types of people and institutions that we had in it. So we had 104 responses to our survey. It took about 5 minutes to complete, which is what we wanted. We didn't want to be a drag on people's time. I feel like we had good representation. We had mostly public libraries, 66%, private at 31%, and 3% for other. The bottom left-hand corner is the FTE representation, so I also feel like we had a lot. We have the most in the 1 to 5,000 FTE, but also quite a few in the 20,000 plus. On the right-hand side, this is the total faculty and staff size. So, something I should have asked first. Did anybody in this room complete this survey? We got one. Okay, cool. We thought there might be a few of you in here to see what the results were. So this is the total faculty and staff size, and this is not counting student workers and things like that. So everybody, we had 62 institutions that had 50 or less, and from 51 plus, we had 34. So a little bit on the smaller side, depending on what your definition of small is, but also a fairly good representation of the different institution sizes in terms of faculty and staff. So about the survey takers themselves. So we had also, I think, pretty good representation and experience, although almost 40% of the people who took the survey had 20 plus years of experience working in the library profession. And you can see that we also had 10 to 15 is another really strong number. The liaison responsibilities in the bottom left-hand corner is almost split. 56 said that they do have liaison responsibilities, 43 said that they don't. On the right-hand side, you can see the breakdown of responsibilities. The e-resources people are coming in pretty heavy, acquisitions, serials, cataloging, and also reference is a strong number. My favorite thing about this slide is that no matter how many categories we listed, almost 30% of people said other. And I think that that's representative of just what the landscape looks like within libraries, in technical services, involved with collection development, that with all of these 10 whatever categories, we still found people that said, yeah, none of these really capture what I do in my library. So we don't have a drum roll, but if we had one, it would come on right before this next slide, because this is the overall takeaway and the thing that we wanted to learn from the survey. And it's a small sample of 104, but we basically wanted to know what people thought in terms of making collections decisions if you weren't a specialist in the field or an assigned liaison to a department. And in general, if you haven't been listening and you stop listening shortly, and according to our pool, the majority of people think that other people in the library should be involved in collections development decisions. Obviously, that can mean a lot of different things. There may be special projects at these people's libraries. They may be hiring consultants, things like that. So it's a very broad, answer to a question, but it's sort of our umbrella question that we wanted to take a look at. So survey assumptions. Before we looked at the data, we thought it might be a good idea for us all to sort of jot down notes about what we thought we were going to learn from the survey. This picture of Homer Simpson was tagged as free to reuse on a website. I don't think that that's true, but that's my defense for putting it up here. And so we're just going to talk briefly about what we all thought that we would find as a result of the survey. And then this is an active discussion session. I don't know if you knew that or not, but then we also would like to kind of turn it over to the room to see maybe what they thought that we were going to find after we talk about what we thought we were going to find. We do have the one mic in the room. I'm not sure if we can pass it around or not. We can. Okay, so we can pass it around and just kind of let everybody tell us what they think that they were going to find. So the first one is mine, and I thought the entire responses were going to be dictated on how many people they had in the library. I thought it was going to be totally dependent on resources, so that if you only had 2 people working in the library, you were going to say, no, it's absolutely essential for staff and other people to help make collections decisions. And if you had these really large libraries, I was making the assumption that if the staff and faculty were large and the FTE was large, you would have enough resources to say, absolutely, we want to make our selectors and our liaisons responsible for collection development. And this turns out to not really be the case. So again, according to our pool, the number of people who said that they thought only subject specialists or liaisons should make collections development decisions, you can see on the left-hand side that there were just as many people with small libraries who were saying that this is the case. So we're talking about 10 or less, between 11 and 20, 21 and 30. We had nobody in the 151 plus that said yes to this, which was surprising to me, again, based on that assumption that I had with the data. The right-hand side, these are the people who said no, there should be other people involved in making collections decisions. And you do see we do have strong representation for smaller libraries, but we also see that when we get to the end. When we have 100 plus, we have 18 in the 100 plus category. So the thing that actually was a little bit encouraging to me about this is that the philosophy of how collection development should be handled within a library wasn't being dictated solely by resources, or at least that's the way that I kind of look at this. I was expecting to see it much more skewed to one side than it is. And now Charlie's going to talk about the assumption that he had.
All right, so I had two big assumptions. The first assumption was that there would be some sort of clear delineation between people who do instruction or some kind of first-year experience, thinking that technical services should not be involved in the collection development process, and the other side of that coin would be that technical services should be involved in that. The other one that I was really interested in looking at was the length of library experience. Did that affect how people felt about whether tech services should be involved? That one's a little more murky. My general assumption was that people who had been in the business for 10 years or longer would be more open to having a more collaborative collection development policy in place, whereas people that had been, who are newer to the profession with 10 years or less experience would be a little more hands-off if they were doing instruction and first-year experience. And I'll turn it over to Corey to discuss his assumptions. Oh, sorry.
So I've learned not to have assumptions. If anything, it's a safer route to take, I think.
Okay, so the first thing that I'll dig into, or do we want to open it up first?
Yeah, if you guys want to, you can do that as well. Maybe do
Oops.
what you learned from it.
Oh, nah, all right. I'm not good at presentation slides, I'm sorry. Yeah. They keep me locked up in a cave. It's bad. So when it comes to library experience and inclusionary collection development, the number of responses that had 10 years of experience, at least 10 years of experience, there were 78 respondents that fell into that category. The number of people that responded no to that question was 59. So I'm sorry, question 11 was, do you think that only subject specialists should be doing collection development? The people that responded yes to that question was 19, so we saw my hypothesis was kind of blown out of the water with those numbers. I put two of the more interesting quotes that we got regarding this. Basically, the first quote is somebody that has a pretty strong opinion about tech services not being involved, and it is basically that in the academic library, having a collaborative or more inclusionary collection development between instruction and first-year experience librarians and tech services reduces the quality of the library. I was kind of expecting to hear some people have that opinion, so I disagree, but it wasn't surprising to see that someone was pretty open and honest about having that opinion. And again, the second quote, they can make decisions in the area of technical services, but for the most part, subject specialty areas should be the main focus of collection development, and tech services should not be involved. Did I go the wrong way again? Okay. Sorry. Regarding the length of service, again, I thought that if people that had 10 years or less experience would be a little more hands-off the collection development thing. This data actually also blows that out of the water, and I was wrong based on the data that we found. The number of responses from people that had 10 years or less experience was 26. 23 of them said no to the question of should you only be the ones doing collection development if you're a subject specialist. Only 3 people answered yes to that. And again, the two quotes that I thought best sum that up. I think collection development decisions need to be a collaboration between tech services and liaisons. Problems arise when liaisons and tech services don't communicate with each other. That's kind of what I've been saying for years as we kind of went through some of these growing pains. And again, the second quote is imperative at the very least, employees who do purchasing of materials have the ability and freedom to make at least some selection purchasing decisions. And again, that kind of sums up my my overall theory or summary of how I manage my department. One of the things that I've been telling people is every year without fail, there are thousands and thousands of unspent allocated dollars sitting in some of these funds. And I know that, I know that people have strong opinions about this, but at the same time, we kind of have this holistic view of everything that's being requested and everything that's coming in. We see the different requests that are coming in from faculty, not just liaisons in the library. So my general rule of thumb is that, okay, we're kind of behind the curtain when we're not doing quite the outreach, but at the same time, we have this holistic view of kind of what's going on. And everybody in my department still has a master's degree. So when we have to make decisions, the whole theory that we're not capable of making good decisions and spending state dollars in a responsible way just doesn't really wash with me. We have I have at my disposal a number of people that have degrees in other fields. They don't just have library degrees. There's only one person who doesn't have a master's, but she'll have one in 6 months. So this whole theory that we're incapable of making responsible, reasonable decisions about growing the collection was just never anything that was just unacceptable to think that, as far as I was concerned. Okay, so regarding, did I discuss this one already? I don't think I did. So the number of respondents who identified themselves as instructors involved in first-year experience, or involved in first-year experience, was 30. The breakdown to question 11 was only 6 people felt that they should be the only ones making collections decisions. 24 of them said that it should be more inclusionary or collaborative. And I think that's good.
So maybe before we jump in to kind of our discussion prompts, maybe we could kind of ask the audience what assumptions you might have or what Charlie reported on it. Does that resonate with you? Have you had similar experiences? Just by a quick show of hands, how many of you work in collection development? Okay. How many of you work in just technical services back-end acquisitions? How many work in both? And how many content service providers, vendors do we have in the room? Sweet. Okay. Perfect. Great. So maybe we could start by asking those of you that work in only one of those, how do you feel about collection development? Do you feel like you should have a role? If you're on the collection development side, do you think acquisitions librarians, cataloging librarians should even be involved in it? And then vice versa. Does anybody want to be first? There you go.
I'd also point out, too, that we had 104 responses, and 70 of those people chose to write really verbose comments at the end of the survey. So I think that that's partly why we thought this would work as the lively discussion. So we'll just start passing the microphone around, and if you would just say your name and kind of your role in collection development, and then what you think about some of these questions and some of the things that you've heard today.
I'm Austina Jordan. I work at the University of North Georgia, and up until about a month ago, I was a collection management librarian, but now I'm head of access services, and I am excited that I was able to keep collection development as a part. So I'm only collecting for 2 areas, but I was glad to keep because it's just a part of my brain I want to keep active in that world, and so I was glad my boss let me keep 2 areas. So
I'm Ann Miller. I'm the interim dean for collections at, interim associate dean for collections at the University of Oregon, and addressing the the question about length of service. I have 30 years working in library science, and I've been a reference librarian. I've been a subject liaison for everything from music to chemistry. I've been head of public documents, and now I'm the head of technical services and access services. And so I think what that brings you as someone who's looking at collections is it brings you lots of different perspectives and different experiences. I've done it at small schools, and I was at Duke for 14 years. So I think that's why you're seeing some of the results that kind of surprise you, is that those of us who've had experience, just like anybody else, we haven't gotten into one job and stayed there forever. That said, I really am unhappy to hear that your subject liaisons think that technical services people can't make good collection decisions. And I feel your pain about the money going lacking. And my answer is, at some point, you haven't spent it, it's mine, and I'm now going to spend it.
I worked for him, and that's what he does. So that does happen. Other comments?
My name is Chris Stewart. I work at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. We've had falling enrollments over a number of years and drastically cut budget, which affects the collection development decisions. We've moved to a just-in-time model from a just-in-case. That means that a lot of our collection development decisions are more and more data-driven, and the liaisons and the collection development librarians, they don't, frankly, they don't know how to draw the data that is used in data-driven decisions, nor do they know how to ask questions of the data that we have available to ourselves. Also, I think that in our case, we all understand at my university that this is a pragmatic arrangement. It's not the ideal arrangement. And so in the survey, what you should do may balance on how you understand that question of, are you going for an ideal situation, or are you solving pragmatic problems?
So I'm Jessie Copeland from Emory University, and I think the issues we see more so is I'm in technical services. I don't really need to be involved in the decision making as to what specific titles are collected, but we have an issue with liaisons perhaps trying to dictate what vendors we use. I like that sales rep, and I say, well, yes, but from this other company we get the cataloging records, and then we also get a lot of how to catalog something, and I say, well, they're using a lot of anecdotal evidence as to how people are using the catalog, whereas I say back it up with some data from Primo, because I don't believe people are using the catalog that way anymore. So I think part of this is what do you define as collection development, and what do you define as, in this case, acquisitions? Because I think they overlap, and whether or not vendor choice is part of that collection development or not. So, fun things. Don't tattle on me.
My name is Idurun Kelawa from Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'm Science and Engineering Collections Librarian. It all depends on the institution. We have a dedicated collection department. So all we do is collection. Our acquisitions department work in collaboration with us when we select, they are the people that are at the front end with the vendors, and they are the people that send our orders out and get them in, and so on and so forth. So my problem with some of your questions, that technical services should be included or should do collection decision, is that collection decision is not something that you just do off the cuff. For me, it takes experience. It takes a number of years for you to cultivate the process of selecting the necessary titles for the collection. It's not something that you can just say, oh, today this person is going to start collecting. It will take that person a long time. We have liaisons who said they don't want to be involved because at the end of the year, they don't spend their money. and we don't give them a lot of money. We just give them money for the reference collection. And still, it's difficult for them to juggle between consultation, instruction, and so on, and then making collection decisions. So that is where I come from. You have to, you have to know what your institution is all about. If your institution just wants to distribute money for everybody to do collection management, you're going to get what you're looking for in your collection. Your collection might not be robust enough. It all depends. That's my take.
Closer. Is this on? Can you hear me? All right. I can't hear myself. I'm David Brennan. I'm from McDaniel College. We are a tiny school in difference to the universities out there. Our collection development model is distributed. I was very curious to see the numbers out there, that there was the lessening of differences with your respondents from very small schools. Of course, we do everything. I mean, there's only 6 librarians, so we all do some level of collection development, including myself, and I'm head of tech services. But I have liaison responsibilities, I have instruction responsibilities, the whole bit. We try and shuffle some of it off to our faculty, which does skew the collection to a degree because they're only collecting in areas that are of interest to them and what's in their curriculum. But we reserve a fair amount of Gen X stuff for ourselves. What ends up happening, we have the same problem with the unspent dollars towards the end of the year. We try and keep them in the loop, right, and say, look, here's your budget, and if you're not going to spend out, I'll spend it for you. But I don't really advertise that because I don't want to do their job for them. But we end up at the end of the year with a pool of things that we also have to spend out. So, I mean, it's interesting that regardless of people's structures and regardless of, how we approach it, we end up having the same problems.
Jane Strudwick from University of Connecticut, FTE of 29,000. I come from a medium-sized Florida library too, doing the same thing, and I'm head of acquisitions and discovery. What we've played with this year, especially we had a big end of year, we had 2 separate spreadsheets, the wish list that came from the subject selectors that we had put together, and we also had what we called strategic things, like we knew we had to do back files, we knew we had to weed, if we had a negotiation with one vendor that would, if we bought something, that it would take away from some of our recurring costs and things like that. Selectors don't know that stuff, so and it's always, we try to merge those things together and explain why we're doing these, so we did that, we separated it out.
Me again. So I think one question, though, that this kind of brings up is how much collection development is actually being done by people anymore, because for instance, at Emory, I mean, we have approval plans. The amount of money that our subject liaisons actually control is extraordinarily small. They control their serial budgets, and they have small book buying budgets, but for the most part, it's all approval plans. So how much does this kind of matter I mean, obviously in smaller places that do more hands-on, it's a little bit different. That I worked at a place that was like that. And so it's a lot easier. But I mean, we used, where I was before, we used a lot of just basically choice. Hey, it's on the choice list for this subject, we're gonna get it. And boom, it was done.
Well, that's what happens at the end of the year, is that if they don't spend out, the first thing I do is hop into Gobi and I pull the curated list, right? And they've already done the curation, and they've done it from a variety of things, choice reviews and whatnot, and I start spending until I spend it out. But I'm not the subject specialist in that sense. I'm just trying to clear my budget so that I don't get nailed next year. So.
We'll have to move the mic from the front of the room. Come on, you guys in the back. I would note, too, that one of the things, I've been having conversations with our assistant dean for finance and administration. She's basically the big budget, whereas I'm the collections budget. And we've had some rather large carry forwards for the last couple of years. We're allowed to carry forward money from one fiscal year to the next. And I keep saying to my subject specialists, we can't do that, because at some point the university is going to look at it and go, you obviously don't need this money, so we're going to take it back. And her point is even a different one, is that as we look, we are an ARL. We're one of the smallest ARLs, so I'll say that right up front. But one of the things we want to look at is how much money are we spending per student? And if you're not spending that money, it doesn't look like it brings that, sort of number down. And when you start looking at how you're doing in terms of supporting academics, it starts to look bad. So I'm on a mission to just say, if you're not going to spend it, we're going to get all together. We're going to talk about databases, one-time purchases that we think will meet your needs, meet the needs, and we're going to spend it, because we can't keep up doing this. And the challenge for me is that when I see that subject specialists aren't expending their funds, when I try to pull that money back in, except at the 80% deadline, they all know about that now. But if I try to pull money back in when I'm to reallocate money, it's like a bomb went off. It's like, oh my God, you're taking away my money. And it's like, then yeah, so spend it already.
My name is Mandy Smith. I'm the sales librarian at the University of Arkansas Fayetteville. And my experience is slightly different from my hearing. I started there 3 years ago, and I basically inserted myself in the collection process. So, before something we knew, I'm like, do you know how low usage there is? Have you seen the trend of it declining, cost per use, in times of if something new is like, have you seen the turn away in the ILL data for this? And I've sort of, which we want as data-driven 3 years ago, and now everything almost is data-driven. I'm so happy about that. So as I explain to vendors, I sort of advise, selectors recommend, and library administration decides. That's kind of where I see, at least in my institution. I do think there's a place for us to kind of insert ourselves, because there's a lot of data out there that I think I provide the data, they look at the context and faculty feedback, and they make their recommendations, kind of how it is in my institution.
So I actually think that's a good segue into our next slide and first discussion prompt, which asks the question, is collection development on life support? And I think some of you kind of touched upon that, but here are some quotes that we pulled directly from the survey. So in relation to automation, when patrons request a new book, it should automatically be purchased. Our discovery system embeds a feature that enables direct requests for resources from all authorized users. The bulk of materials come from packages of various types. And then on staffing, we are in an ARL library with no librarian subject liaisons, and we are very short-staffed, and we all wear several hats. So thinking about those quotes and some of the stuff that you guys said, like what's your reaction to those quotes? We've talked about approval plans and kind of the automation there, and subject liaisons may not actually be doing much collection development anymore, right? A lot of things are on autopilot. We've talked about short staff and people wearing different hats. So questions I might ask are, do we want to move further along to more automation? Should we be looking at spending our human capital in different ways and just get out of the collection development game somewhat more? Do we need to invest more in collection development and pull away from the automation to ensure that our collection development is actually meeting the needs? So what reactions do you have to that statements or other opinions you might have about these quotes?
And I would also say, going back to that slide where we had the almost 30% of people that said I'm other than those 10 categories, we're kind of seeing that represented here, that it's hard to form a consensus because all this stuff is so dependent on your institution and where you work. I mean, the process that you described actually sounds like a really well thought out, it sounds like people are working really well together. If you're providing data, people are looking at content, and then it's going up a chain to someone making a decision. But the other issue that I think that was brought up is about expertise and like where that comes from. And that was something that, not my last institution, but 2 ago, where we were looking for somebody to do some collection development in a field, and there was someone in the room with a master's degree in that field, but because they didn't have the library degree, it was like completely passed over and not even discussed. So to kind of add to that element of the collection development, if we're talking about expertise and things like that, and if we need that instead of patrons making the decision or a vendor making it or an approval plan, where does expertise come from? Are people open to that being a one-on-one conversation where you demonstrate that you have knowledge of the field, or do you put a lot more stock in the degree because you have confidence that they've had that training through their program?
You mentioned expertise, and I hate to say it helps to have that knowledge, but I'm not even sure how relevant it is, because your expertise needs to be based on how your school, faculty, and programs use things. We don't have unlimited money to, or even extra money to spend to develop a really true big collection. I'm from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We've always been short-staffed. We're R1 right now. We've never had bibliographers, never could afford them. We have an approval plan because we didn't have people ever to process it. We outsourced. We lost all that. We used our public services staff as the connection to faculty so that we would shape our choices, but more often than not, it always rested within technical services / collections. So it was never any way. We also were, when I look in hindsight, I've been there over 20 years, and Serial's e-resources, I was the first one. We all based it on the point of need at the time, basing on what our program faculty requests were. It would have been lovely to say, you know, we actually developed this. Unless we had special funding to do that, that's the way it is. And now we're going more to a data-driven, because we just, you know, you're always cutting and you're, you know, trying to sacrifice or, you know, get the most relevant at the time. So some of this seems like it was never that way for us. The bigger problem we're having, we've always had a collection development committee, and the public services, or you select a few that were on that to try and get that, or I would directly work with who's assigned that. You do history, I'll work with you, you know, type stuff. And I guess my point of lapping around is I want to ask either for now or later, do you find that with your public services staff or whoever's sort of defaulting that, is it harder to get them to give you this kind of information, or even being aware of that? We're getting a generational shift as the older people or librarians who dealt with the print when you used to have a reference collection to basically not having one anymore. We're used to having these responsibilities and looking ahead and kind of doing, to our newer librarians who have different responsibilities, and we're not getting that kind of feedback that we need. But yet again, we're going to data and expanding on how we're trying to do this and looking at different ways. So I'm just wondering what other people's experiences are. And I was going to say one more thing, which happened years ago before I was ever there. We do not allocate the bulk of our money to departments. They get a small allocation. Somebody had the foresight, well, I don't want to be justified to departments, that we just have a huge serials fund, and that's where most things reside. And if you had either the luck or the foresight to do that, it makes your life a lot simpler.
I want that.
Anybody else want to comment on? I will say, I mean, we had other, we did have other questions. We didn't present all of them. We had quite a few, and we did have one about whether or not collection development happened at your institution by committee, and there was a large % of people who replied that there was. And then we had some other questions about the makeup of that committee, because that's been a whole other debate at a previous library of mine as well, and you know, who should be on that committee as well.
So I think
it's very dependent upon what type of school you're at. So I'm at an R1, we have subject liaisons. Many of them have advanced degrees in their subject areas. Our faculty expect that. We have more of a generational gap with faculty. They want, you know, I get these, because I'm in tech services, we get these journal requests. We already have it online. Yeah, the faculty member knows that, but he wants it in print too, just in case. And it's like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Have you seen the cereal room? It is covered in, you know, 2 inches of dust, but whatever. But I think when it comes to collection development with institutions, it seriously depends on the type of institution. I would say even though, you know, at my institution, yes, we have subject specialists, and even though they only control a small portion, it's important for their relationship with their departments and their faculty. Now, at my former institution, it was a 4-year state college, and I would argue that this kind of comes into what we as professional librarians know. I think a librarian can be trained to do collection development in any subject. I have a BA in history. I've done collection development for IT, for nursing, and so it just depends on your institution, but also on your training. Honestly, at a place like Emory, the history department would not really accept me too well because I just have a BA, but that's just that. But keep in mind, there are very, very few Emorys versus everybody else. There's far, far more state colleges in the United States than there are Research One institutions. And so I think it comes to a question of the profession, the library profession, and we've struggled with this because sometimes we hire subject librarians that don't have MLSs because they have advanced degrees in their areas, and that's what's important for subject librarians at our institution. But when it comes to smaller ones, I'm not so much sure. I'm not sure if that.
I think I agree that it all depends on the institution. In my institution, we are also R1, and we have approval plan, but that is not all we have. We also have money for selection. That money is not small. I have $134,000 to select title by title, and that's not a small amount. So it all depends on the institution. And what I learned, you have been doing collection management for a long time, so I have developed several collections. And what I see is that it's not easy to learn collection development in a subject that you are not familiar with in just maybe a couple of months or 1 year or so. It's something that you build over several years. That's my experience. Whether collection development is on life support, in some institutions it might be. And depending on the budget and depending on whether the budget is being spent well or not. But it all depends on the institution and the staff and the librarians that they have. So that's my experience.
And so I'm going to ask a question of the panel. Were you looking only at the development or the acquisition of new materials, or you were also talking about collection management and the life cycle of management of the collection?
I was just focused on incoming materials. We weren't getting into the whole life cycle. It was just new stuff being added to the collection. I think we have somebody in the back.
I was going to say that over 5 years of contraction, where subject expertise is most relevant is in what resources to cut rather than what resources to add.
I wanted to bring it back to this question of, is collection development on life support? I'm new in the role of being head of collection development, and I find that at my institution, it's a faculty-driven collection. Faculty are very involved. They see slips, they buy books. But I think the liaisons have recently been hired in various shiny skill sets that we need. So research data management, scholarly communications, whatever, you know, all the fancy stuff that's going on right now. And so bringing it back to collection development and spending some time on that is really challenging. And, you know, I think for 5 years or so, we could go with like straight automation and, you know, let the collection just grow organically from whatever the faculty want. But I think that and that'll be fine. But then after that 5 or 10 years, you will find that the collection is no longer supporting the teaching needs that these specialty librarians have. And so that when they start reaching on the shelf and the thing that they need isn't there, then it'll be an emergency that we need to do collection development again. And so I'm hoping to prevent that by, you know, coming up with models that are sustainable for everyone, because time is very valuable right now, and understanding, since we have the faculty for their subject expertise, understanding what you just need to do in terms of outreach and kind of really framing it in that vein of like, just, you know, make sure your faculty know they can order things, and, you know, be aware of what your faculty are ordering, so then you can help, you know, build your classes and do your teaching, has been a different approach for us. But I think it's, you know, starting to gain a little bit of traction, and we're doing that in a collaborative way.
Thanks. And so maybe we'll jump to the next slide too,
Yeah.
if you want to. So thanks. And so our next discussion prompt was, should technical services folks decide? And again, the survey was kind of all over the place. We had some people that thought, sure. Where else would collection management librarian be housed if not in technical services? So kind of the organizational structure of the library there. No way. Technical services librarians and staff should be free to make recommendations, but not decisions. And then we had some people that it depended on a case by case and what we're talking about. So whether this person is in public or technical services isn't as important, and neither is whether this person is a faculty or staff member, but it needs to make sense. So kind of the workflow. And then staff do not have the administrative authority, nor are they paid enough to make collections decisions or spend collection funds. So kind of the same question. Is that surprising? How do you guys feel about those statements? How does it work in your institution? If you're a collection development librarian who doesn't want technical services folks involved, we'd love to hear from you. If you're tech services people who aren't involved, but like Charlie feels, and me too, feels like you have some qualification to do that, you know, what's kind of how it works there, and your thoughts on those as well. And then also another question I would have is, given our kind of approval plans and automation and stuff like that, are there cases where faculty members and or students are in a better position to make decisions about collections, or even perhaps vendors on how they look, so that part of the automation process, we're willing to kind of step back a little bit and let our users or our suppliers help us make decisions?
Well, I think like a lot of people, our budgets are flat, so if something comes in, something has to go out in terms of especially subscriptions. So that decision tends to devolve to some degree back into technical services. I mean, we're in charge of the money, and we know where our budgets are and what we can do and how we can maneuver. If I was to tell my acquisitions coordinator, who is staff, not a librarian, that she couldn't have decision making, she'd kill me. Because there just has to be that ability to make the call at some point. But on the flip side, I don't know what every faculty is teaching, right? So this is why we rely upon them to make some of those decisions, because I don't read through every syllabi that is available, and most of them aren't for that matter. But I'm not intimately familiar with every class that's taught. So it's even in my own liaison area, I don't know every single thing that every faculty is teaching. So you have to devolve it at some point. And every institution is going to devolve it in a different way. In the R1s, of course, there's the research interest. We're an undergraduate teaching college. We don't do research or very little research. So that doesn't come into play. But the equation's going to look a little bit different. But I think anybody that says kind of as a blanket that, no one at this level should be able to weigh in on those decisions is cutting off a resource they should be using.
Yeah, and one of the things that surprised me talking about assumptions is that when I started reading some of the comments, I realized that there were quite a few people who weren't involved in making the decisions and they actually didn't want to be. So that was a big assumption on my part, was that everybody wants to be involved in collection development. And then we had several comments that were like, A, we don't want to, B, we're not paid enough to do so. So there's also that element that we're assuming that everybody wants to be spending money and making collections decisions within the library, and that's not always the case. They feel like maybe that's going outside of the kind of work they're supposed to be doing at the library. Another comment here.
I've been sitting here listening to a number of you describe your organizations, and I'm realizing very quickly that we may actually be kind of a hybrid model. At the University of Maryland, we do have distributed decision-making for subject selection in terms of area expertise. That said, as Director of Collections, I sit by side with the Director of Collection Development. We belong to the same division. And at times, there is not a lot of daylight between the two of us in terms of how we make decisions and sort of the reliance on each other. Without the data produced by my units, those decisions would not be founded in any sort of logic, particularly when you're talking about a large ARL budget. More often than not, I work in tandem with my colleague in collection development to guide our subject librarians toward a more holistic thinking process, because it can be a challenge for them to see the impacts of their decisions on a local level on a much larger budget. And as someone earlier said about approval plans, I mean, the reality is there's very little title-by-title decision-making going on, because on the flip side of that, we are a large library, we participate in journal agreements, so to a great degree, the decision-making for journals has been taken away as well due to those contractual obligations. As we draw down on some of that, as we start making decisions about our print footprint, the need for data is greater and greater. Again, some of our subject experts are more responsive than others. Many of you are laughing, yes. So sometimes you have to lead by making sure that you give them a deadline. If I don't hear from you by X, the default decision will be Y. And in effect, we are making decisions. We are already making collection development decisions and have had for some time, in part because there is a budget, it must be spent. I wish we had the option of carrying forward, but we do not. Use or lose. Use or lose.
Great, and then, excuse me. So our next discussion prop is really what matters. So some things that came up in the survey were kind of ease of use and decisions from technical services people that were really based more around workflow and what made our lives easier versus maybe the collection content or working with specific vendors that a subject liaison would prefer us work with, but we already have systems in place and workflows that work, and then also stability. So that, according to this respondent, often liaison subject librarians may make collecting decisions that do not have long-term stability. So questions we might have is, what does that mean for your institution? What exactly is a stable collection development decision? Does that make sense for your institution? Have you found that subject liaisons who are making decisions don't really understand the full picture? Are there things that you've done to help them understand the holistic viewpoint. It sounds like some of you have some work in that area, which is great. Some of us may have some more work to do. So just thoughts on those quotes or anything really about what's most important when it comes to the collection development kind of route and how technical services can play a role in that.
I think I see the challenge for this most starkly in electronic resources. If it's weird and opaque or odd, they will find it. And often they're the faculty that are finding it. So we'll get a request for something that turns out to be GIS data that's only downloadable on a particular kind of format and then installed on a particular kind of format. And so that creates that long-term stability. It creates issues with access and IT. It creates the sort of the preservation of that kind of product. So that's one of the things that we've had to have conversations about, primarily in the area of data resources, because we have a GIS operation. And just how do we go about purchasing those, and how do we interact with departments that are responsible for maintaining and providing access. I disagree with the first part, but that's okay. I can disagree with it. And I think that that's a result of a lack of conversation between two, departments.
Anyone else for this one? Yeah, the way that I read that top comment was that it makes it sound like they just want to do things that are easy to maintain and kind of have well-worn workflows. But if you talk to people in technical services, it's probably going to be because there's a huge backlog, their staff has been cut, they don't have enough people to maintain it. So rather than it just being sort of like they're looking for the easiest thing to do, it's like it's not going to happen very quickly or at all. And so some of the times these things fall into well-worn workflows just because it's the way that it can be maintained the best.
Let me jump in for a second. I think that's an issue for us when it comes to our DVD collection. We have a growing film program, and a lot of liaisons are very in favor of streaming packages and films on demand and getting the Criterion collection streamable. Some of this is going to depend on the economics of your student base. We have a lot of students that really don't have their own computers. We have a laptop checkout program. We could add 1,000 a week. Like they go through, we have so many rental or checkout laptops. It's crazy. So, people ask, why don't you buy Blu-ray DVDs? And it's because a lot of our students need these laptops that we check out, and they're not going to play Blu-ray, or they don't have reliable internet connections where they live. So if they might have an apartment, but a lot of people live without internet. So if they're home, they can't do some of the things that are media related. So I understand I understand that sometimes we're making decisions that don't make sense to subject selectors or liaisons, but we do have to think about the long-term stability. It's inconvenient for some people to come to the library to get 5 or 6 Criterion titles, but we know that we're going to get the longest bang for our buck, and we don't have to worry about titles disappearing from packages. So that's something that we're struggling with right now. Should we go to the next slide?
So there was not a question about the role of vendors on the survey, but this is something that comes up and certainly comes up in discussions that I have with people, and that's the role that vendors play in collection development. So just some thoughts we had. Vendors play the role of supporters, right? They're providing us with usage, cost per use data, turn away data. They keep us informed of new materials for collections. As influencers, sometimes they're contacting faculty or users directly to talk about products, which can trickle back in to the library in terms of purchase requests. They're clearly creating new business models, creating technology and ways to access that. And then in kind of antagonistic roles, prices continue to go up, which certainly impact our collection development abilities. And then, as you're all aware, they continue to buy one another, so there's less competition, which also kind of impacts our choices. So some questions I had with this: does that sound right to you? Would you move some of those things around? one thing that jumps out to me is maybe some people might think contacting faculty directly might be an antagonistic approach instead of an influential one. And then also, for my own personal curiosity, most of all, I've been doing this for about 10 or 11 years. I've worked in smaller institutions and big institutions, and the problems seem to be more or less the same everywhere. And looking at the capability of vendors, do we see a future on the horizon where libraries have been taken out of the collection development process or largely removed from it? Vendors have the capabilities, they have the subject experts, publishers have PhDs on staff that can have better conversations in theory directly with faculty and understand where they're coming from, create content that directly meets their needs, and then approach a provost or an office of research directly and kind of cut the library out. Thinking about how we kind of run up to the end of the year and we have money to spend, I'm sure if we gave all of our money to a vendor on the front end, they would be happy with that and we wouldn't have to worry about carryover, right? So do we see a future where vendors can play a bigger role? Should they be playing a bigger role? Does that free up resources within the library to focus on things like student success if we're not focusing on collection development or having large cataloging or technical services, departments?
I think some people have tried that by doing the PDA, where students will pick, and then first of all, the vendors will download all the titles in their catalog, and then the students will pick, or faculty will pick, whenever they hit 5 times or something like that, it will trigger a purchase. And then a lot of them are going back on it because it's not working. So they've tried that. So I don't see a future where, for me, I don't see a future where we will just leave everything to vendors and then leave vendors with Office of Research and faculty. I don't see that future. Because the reason I don't see that future is because vendors are there for themselves. They're not going to say, oh, because you have this program, only 2 people are in that program. You still have that program. They're going to dump those titles in those two for that program that has only 2 people in it. They're going to dump those books on you and spend a lot of money, or they're going to give you packages that you don't need. It's not going to work. For me, it's not going to work. I don't see that future.
So I know we had a couple of vendors in the room, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but how do you feel about that? I would love it if you said you wanted to dump things that we didn't need on us, because that would be refreshing and honest. But I don't know that that's a totally true statement. So I would be curious to kind of get if a vendor wants to be brave and kind of address how you might play a bigger role in the future of collection development.
I'm not a traditional kind of vendor. We do outsourcing for cataloging, but it doesn't make any sense that a vendor would dump. If you were giving them your responsibility for doing collection development, they would want to show their value in giving you the best that they can give with the experts that they have. If they provided a bunch of junk, why would you do that again the next year? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yesterday, I was in a session in which we talked about the Sci-Hub problems. There were librarians and vendors and all of us together, how we can solve this issue. So I like to daydream today, when you talk about the vendor. Well, it's not just the vendor and customer relations, but we are, in a way, colleagues who are maintaining sustainable scholarly communications environment. So when vendors approach, for example, the faculty about their product, why they don't talk also about the libraries? How much it will cost? So, you're promoting your product, but also promote the libraries at the same time so that faculty and other stakeholders can support the library more. So in this way, we can grow up together instead of dividing small pies, let's make the pie bigger so you can get more piece. I'm daydreaming again. So.
I think part of that is your relationship with your vendor rep. I find experienced rep do exactly that. They have been, when I ask for pricing for an electronic resource, I'm right up front as I'm asking pricing. We don't have the money, but what you're doing is providing me because it's a couple years down the road, and so we kind of work together. Freely contact me at this, we see where we are, and we kind of build whatever relationship along it. We also have been, a colleague of mine, been working with our vendor reps as far as materials that we do have, and also contact with faculty. They've been getting very successful at this, so they can come in and assist our faculty as well, and it's been a much better relationship. So I do think they're there. They're not, you have to work at them. It does somewhat depend on how much of a revolving door you have with, your representative and, how much you can get this time. But you need to be clear about what's your expectation. When you mentioned about contact faculty and users, I want to know when you're contacting faculty and this. And again, the best ones, they copy you right on the, that they're asking for a trial. They loop you in right away. If they get, in fact, I got the name, somebody actually here meeting with one of the vendor reps that somebody, called them, talked to them, so it's something we can address when we go back. But you have to have that open relationship with them as well, and then you can have some of that dynamic.
We're about to run out of time, so I just want to get to the last slide really quickly. We have some plans to kind of refine some of this and expand the project to maybe do this again in the future. So we wanted to get some feedback from the people that were in the session. What should we be asking on this topic? What kind of information would be good to parse out in a survey like this that would help us come to a better understanding of where we kind of fit in all of this? What didn't we ask that would be useful to help spread the word? I think somebody back there has.
I think, asking what size an institution is, so maybe we can break it down and start seeing trends within different sized institutions would be one thing.
Yeah, we actually had one of the questions and we broke it down by, 5, 10, 15, 20, or 20 plus. And we were looking for correlations between attitudes towards technical services and collection development based on years of library experience. I can share that with you if you want to come up after we're done here. Anybody else?
I was wondering in the survey if you asked institutions if they were collaborating across institutions on collection development or sharing liaisons or trying to build up more specialized collections that way.
We did not ask that, actually. That was not one of the questions that we asked. Maybe that would, maybe adding some sort of consortial component into shared collections would be something that would be useful data to parse out if we can do this again.
Based on this discussion, it seems like the focus was try to see technical services part in it, but the question was broader than that. So I'd be curious to see if you focused the question, if that would change. The answers would change at all. If that makes any sense. Because you asked, should subject liaisons be the only people? You weren't specifically asked about technical services. There are other people outside of technical services that can play a role. Does that make sense? It might not change, but.
Can you elaborate a little bit more?
The question you showed was, you had asked specifically, should subject liaisons be the only people making decisions?
Mm-hmm.
But you're not asking about anyone else. You're talking specifically about technical services.
Oh, okay.
So it just seems slightly broader than what your focus, this
Mhm.
discussion has been. So if you're trying to get specifically to technical services, it'd be interesting to see responses if you
Okay.
refocus the question.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, great.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very
We're out
much
of
for
time.
coming. We appreciate the interest. Thank you.